All right, I think we can probably get started and just let some people trickle in.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ashley Birdsall. I'm the head of Landlord Success here at PocketList. And for those of you whom we haven't had a chance to meet yet, PocketList is really on a mission to improve transparency, ease, and efficiency of the leasing process in the multifamily rental space for both renters and landlords alike. We take pride in the data and resources we're able to provide property managers and owners to help reduce vacancy rates, turnover times, and fill units faster and with higher quality tenants every time. So this webinar series really is just one of the ways that we hope to provide insight into market trends and provide helpful resources to make your leasing and property management easier and more informed. So thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to an informative session. A couple logistics before we get started. First of all, this is being recorded. Also, all attendees are muted, but you are welcome and encouraged to ask any questions that you would like anytime in the presentation. You just select the little chat icon at the bottom of the menu bar. We will attempt to answer all of your questions live on the call, but if for whatever reason we don't get to your question, we will make sure to answer it after the event via email. So just to go over kind of an agenda for the webinar, we are going to be talking about the effects of COVID on the legal landscape, which is very relevant, including new regulations and protocols, the moratorium extension and what that means, evictions, what you can and can't do right now, and the implications of that. And then things that landlords should be doing differently to protect themselves during this time. We'll also be reviewing landlord relief programs, and we'll leave lots of time for questions and answers because I imagine there will probably be quite a bit. But I did want to make a note that this discussion is mostly LA County centric. But if you do have specific questions kind of outside of that area, we are happy to try to find information for you if we don't know it offhand. And we will do our best to provide more information offline for you. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. So without further ado, I am super excited to introduce you to our guest speaker, Nicole Halle. She is a transactional attorney at Rains Feldman. She has extensive experience advising and representing landlords with respect to tenant disputes. And she's just all around a very lovely person. So we're so appreciative for participation and time in putting this presentation together for us. So thanks again, Nicole, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I just want to thank PocketList, Nick and Ashley and Justin for inviting me to speak today. It's been a pleasure getting to know PocketList and you guys, and the services you offer is really a wonderful tool for landlords and tenants. So today we are going to talk about pandemic leasing in the pandemic, and really what a landlord can do to try to get rent or to evict the tenant. I'm sure that's a pretty hot topic button right now. And when we are looking at leasing and tenants owning rent and evictions, I think we have to take a big picture look at the relevant law that pertains to that. The first thing I want to bring up is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019. And while this doesn't necessarily pertain to COVID, it's still applicable to all evictions. And so as a landlord, you should be aware of it when you are discussing evictions and rent control. And just always have that in the back of your mind, because that added some additional protections to tenants back in 2019. It provides that landlords need to provide certain notices to tenants who may be protected by the act. And there are also additional rent control limitations. The act does not apply to all residential buildings, nor does it apply to all landlords. There are some exemptions, so definitely take a look at that to see if the act even applies to you or your rental building. So always just keep that in the back of your mind, and also just to keep in mind there are a lot of layers and tiers here, and a lot of situations are very specific to the tenant, the type of lease you have, the building, what city you're in, what county you're in, and what state you're in. So we're going to talk about California today, and then we're going to hone in a little bit more, as Ashley mentioned, on LA County and LA City. But let's talk big picture first, California. So a bill was passed last month called SB 91. It was passed to address residential tenants and landlords with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. The bill extends certain deadlines relating to when a tenant is able to repay certain rent, when a landlord can bring an action to recover past rent owed, or when a landlord can bring an eviction action. And it also provides protections for tenants if they are experiencing a COVID-19 related financial hardship and are unable to pay rent during protected periods of time. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Under SB 91, the bill divides when tenants owe rent into two different time periods. The first time period I've referenced here is between March 1st, 2020 through August 31st, 2020. And if your tenant owes rent during this time and hasn't paid rent during this time, there are certain notices you're required to provide the tenant. One of the notices is a notice pursuant to Code of Civil Procedure 1179.04A, which basically gives the tenant notice of what their legal rights are with respect to paying rent and when they would have to repay rent. If you choose to do so, you would serve, and the tenant did not pay rent, you would serve a notice to pay or quit. And notice that now it's a 15-day notice to pay or quit instead of the traditional 3 or 5 day notice to pay or quit, providing tenants with a little bit more time to try to pay the rent or leave the premises. I would also like to note that that 15 days is 15 days excluding court holidays and weekends. So it's pretty much lines up to 15 business days. So that is quite amount of time or extra time that the tenant gets. Along with these notices, you also have to provide the tenant with an unsigned declaration of COVID-19 related financial distress. And that is basically a blank or a document that the tenant can fill out and submit to the landlord that says that they are experiencing a financial hardship related to COVID-19. And then in addition, when the tenant does not pay rent, you should also look to your local laws to see if there's any other additional notices that need to be served to the tenant. Now, after you serve all these notices for rent that was not paid during that time period, the tenant may submit the signed declaration and send it back to you. And if the tenant does so, then the tenant is protected by SB 91. And that means that you cannot seek any sort of rental debt for that time period until the expiration of the moratorium period, and you can't file anything in court until August 1st, 2021. That's a long time away. That's supposed to give the tenant enough time to try to repay it before you have to file an action. Now, what about rent that was due after August 31st, 2020? This is called the transition period for rent that was due between September 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2020. It follows a similar procedure as the rent for the initial protection period, where you have to serve certain notices on the tenant provide the tenant with an unsigned declaration. And here, the tenant has to, if the tenant is going to be protected by SB 91, the tenant has to submit their declaration back to the landlord stating that they are experiencing a COVID-19 related financial hardship. And the tenant also has to pay 25% of the rent owed between September 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2021. So if the tenant does pay that 25% amount, the landlord cannot file an unlawful detainer. Now, the 25% rule is very lenient. The tenant can either pay 25% of the rent each month from September through June, or the tenant can pay 25% of the total rent no later than June 30th. So the landlord won't really know if they have or how much they will be owed or what the balance will be until the end of that June 30th, 2021 period. Now, if the tenant fails to comply, the landlord is able to file an action against the tenant for rent owed during that period, and the landlord is able to do so starting August 1st. I'd also like to note that for rental debt owed during these periods, the landlord will be able to file in small claims court, even if the amount you are seeking exceeds the jurisdictional limit in small claims court. So the jurisdictional limit is usually $10,000. If rent owed is more than $10,000, but the rent is COVID rental debt, you will still be able to file in small claims court. It appears the court system is trying to just group everybody together into one department in this case. I'd like to just bring note to what financial distress is considered here. Financial distress is considered loss of income because of COVID-19, increased out-of-pocket expenses directly related to performing essential work during the COVID-19 pandemic, increased expenses directly related to health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, childcare responsibilities or responsibilities to care for an elderly, disabled, or sick family member directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic that limit the tenant's ability to earn income, increased costs for childcare or attending to an elderly, disabled, or sick family member directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic, or other circumstances related to the COVID-19 pandemic that have reduced the tenant's income or increased the tenant's expenses. So there are a lot of ways the tenant can probably check the box to claim a financial hardship. So just be aware of that. In certain circumstances, the landlord can ask for additional documentation, but it appears that it's a pretty broad catch-all for a tenant to be able to claim a COVID-19 hardship. One other thing I would note is that I put here that the landlord can file an action starting August 1st, 2021. That is essentially the earliest the landlord would be able to file an action, but I would also suggest looking to your local local city or county moratoria if there's one in place, because that may provide a different deadline, and we will discuss that in a later slide. Here, as I had mentioned before, the County of Los Angeles implemented an eviction moratorium, which was effective March 4th, 2020, and currently expires February 28th, 2021. The City of Los Angeles implemented an eviction moratorium on March 31st, 2020. So again, just check your specific city and county websites. A lot of the websites are pretty accurate and up to date, and they can provide you with what restrictions are in place, or if you should just look to the state for guidance. And then as I had mentioned before, just keep in mind all three tiers of your city, your county, and your state. Here I go into a little bit more detail about the County of Los Angeles and the City of Los Angeles. For residential tenants in the County of Los Angeles, they are subject to the state's eviction moratorium. In both the county and the city of LA, you cannot charge late fees or interests if the tenant fails to pay rent during the protected or protected or transition periods. So you would only be able to recover rental debt, and you could not charge late fees or interest if the tenant is experiencing a COVID-19 related financial hardship. Here in LA County, tenants have until September 30th, 2021 to repay rent due from what they call the protected period. That's from March 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2020. So if you have a tenant who hasn't paid rent during that time, even though the state provides that you can file an action August 1st, you would actually have to wait until September 30th, 2021 before you filed your action, because as you can see in LA County, they gave the tenant a little bit more time to repay that rental debt. The County of LA defers to the SB 91 bill with respect to the rent owed during the transition period, where if the tenant pays the 25%, then the tenant's protected, and if they don't, then you can file your action beginning August 1st. Excuse me. For the City of Los Angeles, it more or less follows a similar pattern. A tenant who claims a COVID-19 related hardship for their inability to pay rent, the LA City moratorium provides the tenant has 12 months from the expiration of the moratorium or local emergency order to repay the rent. So the City of Los Angeles will it depends when the City of Los Angeles's moratorium expires as to whether or not or when you can start to collect rent that was not paid back. But we're looking at, at least probably a year from now if you have a rental debt, since the moratorium has not been lifted or expired yet. I would also just, again, check your local city regulations to see if there's any additional notices that you need to provide. At this point, I'd also like to mention that it's just important to keep an accurate tenant ledger of how much the tenant owes, if they've paid anything, if they have claimed a COVID-19 financial hardship, and to keep documentation if they had submitted any sort of declaration to you. So we've come to all these restrictions, and so I'm sure you're all wondering, well, are there any evictions that are possible during this time? Yes, there are. They may be limited. I think that the court system is going to cast a very wide net around what is a COVID-19 related hardship. As you can see on the slide, evictions not related to the payment of rent may be permissible, so long as such breach of the lease is also not related to COVID-19. So an example of a non-payment of rent related eviction would be perhaps there's an additional occupant in the unit. So would you be able to evict a tenant based on that essential breach of lease? The answer is maybe. In the County of LA, the moratorium prohibits an eviction based on an additional occupant in the unit, because if the reason that additional occupant is in the unit is because maybe the tenant is caring for someone that suffered a COVID-19 related hardship. So the answer there is maybe. Another eviction not related to the payment of rent would be perhaps a nuisance on the property. However, in the city of LA, it prohibits eviction based on a nuisance where the nuisance is related to COVID-19. So perhaps you have extra dogs staying in your unit for maybe a COVID-19 related reason, that would likely be prohibited. So it's giving the tenant a lot of defenses here. So let's just keep that in mind. Evictions for failure to pay rent where the tenant does not experience a COVID-19 related financial hardship may be possible. So that would, if the tenant did not submit a declaration, or the tenant is, if the tenant did not submit a declaration, you may be able to get the tenant out. The Civil Code of Procedure that was amended by SB 91 kind of will provide the tenant with a second bite of the apple if you do file an eviction action or an action to recover rent. The court will likely ask the tenant, did you submit a COVID-19 financial hardship declaration? And it allows the tenant to possibly say, no, I didn't, but I didn't because of a mistake, or I was misinformed. And maybe the courts will allow the tenant to claim that hardship at that time. So just be cautious of that. The other question is the tenant actually facing financial hardships? A lot of tenants are, but there might be tenants that aren't. And so it's important to evaluate the tenant's financial situation. And the bill does provide for a high income tenant that may not be subject to the moratorium. And a high income tenant is a tenant where the household income is at least $100,000 and at least 130% of the area median income based on the county and number of people in the household. So you need to kind of evaluate if the tenant's a high income tenant, where you are, what the tenant makes, and you are entitled, as a landlord, you are entitled to request certain information to verify whether or not you think they are a high income tenant. And there is also a special notice that you need to serve if you believe that the tenant is a high income tenant. And just a note, I think Ashley will mention this as well. I've mentioned that there's a lot of notices you need to serve on the tenant. And so I believe that PocketList will be sending out email after this webinar with links to the notices, but the notices are also available on the state of California website. And it's pretty user friendly. So if you have any, if you need to find it, you could probably find it there as well. Another eviction that may be permissible during this time is an eviction related to the health and safety. As I had mentioned before, perhaps too many occupants in a unit violates a building code or health and safety code. So there might be some instances where you can evict a tenant based on that. Or perhaps the building needs to undergo certain repairs and construction for safety requirements, or that may be permissible. In no event can an eviction be retaliatory against the tenant or appear to be retaliatory against the tenant. So if the tenant hasn't paid rent and is claiming a COVID-19 financial hardship, but you also find another breach, you're going to have to really evaluate and make a business decision of whether or not this is going to appear to look retaliatory. Because I can tell you that if it appears or is retaliatory, your case will get thrown out right away and you'll have to start from the very beginning. Okay, so what should you be doing differently as a landlord to protect yourself and protect your assets during this time? Well, for leasing, background checks and credit checks on the tenant are always helpful, and definitely help you get a better sense of who your tenant is and what their capability is. Ashley will speak in a couple minutes about a feature that PocketList has that is really helpful. I would mention that you cannot discriminate against a potential tenant because they have another COVID-19 related rental debt. So just be aware of that. Request a security deposit. That's always suggested, even when we're not in a pandemic. I would advise just to be careful about how you apply that security deposit and how your lease says you can apply that security deposit, because some of the moratorium I've seen in place do prohibit landlords from using the security deposit against rental debt that was incurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, or that was incurred because there was a financial hardship on the part of the tenant. Usually you would have to get the tenant's permission to apply the security deposit in that instance. Well, if you have empty units and you'll be showing them to prospective tenants, I think it's just good protocol and practice to have everybody who's coming into your building and into the unit wear masks, open windows for ventilation, do temperature checks, maybe some basic screening questions, just to make sure that you, the property manager, the broker, are protecting themselves and also perhaps protecting other tenants that are already in the building. Some other things you might want to think about during this time is what is your building's COVID protocols. We've seen a lot of buildings where they put a sign at the entrance of the building to require all people that enter the building to wear a mask. Especially in common areas, if you have elevators, perhaps providing hand sanitizer or regularly disinfecting common areas. I would also suggest reviewing your rules and regulations to see if they address COVID-19 or perhaps issues that have come up during the pandemic, maybe with respect to prohibiting people from gathering or closing common areas down. Another good practice would be to just inform your tenants of what you're doing as a landlord to help them during this time. Are you cleaning areas more? Are you wiping down areas more? Are you providing hand sanitizer by elevators? Are you having property managers take additional precautions? I think that's a nice thing to do as a landlord, and maintaining a good relationship with your tenant. And communication, especially during this time between the landlord and tenant, is really important and encouraged. The SB 91, the court websites, a lot of the eviction moratoria that I've read all state we encourage landlords and tenants to discuss any rent-related debt. So they really, everybody really wants the landlord and tenant to be in communication and see what you could be doing to work something out. Let me just go back 1 second. It appears that once landlords are able to file for rental debt during this time, I'm imagining that the courts are going to be inundated. And so if you can try to speak with your tenant and maybe come to some sort of agreement or settlement or payment plan ahead of time, you might be saving yourself time and money because the courts are definitely going to be inundated with claims. SB 91 also allows for landlords to apply for federal funds to pay up to 80% of the back rent owed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if I would encourage landlords to look into applying for this money. If the landlord is granted these funds and receives 80% of the back rent, the landlord has to forgive the 20%, excuse me, of remaining rent that was unpaid. And the landlord can't then also go after the tenant to seek any unpaid rent. So the landlord can't double dip. So this is a nice thing that landlords can look into. I would, not all landlords qualify, so definitely keep this in mind. Um, and I believe you can start applying for this starting next month. Last I checked on the website, the website wasn't loaded yet, but you could sign up to receive updates when you can start applying for the money. The landlord-tenant relationship. So now that we've been almost through a year through the pandemic, I think it's a really good time to look at your lease and see what could really be improved here as a result of what you've experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, or if anything would maybe need to be changed in the future, or if there was any other sort of public emergency. There might be provisions in their lease that can be tightened up or strengthened to help landlords. Certain provisions like protecting a landlord's liability with respect to not being able to provide services because of a government shutdown. There's certain things that you just can't control because of a government shutdown, and I wouldn't want a landlord to be exposed because there was something that was out of their control. Also, try to limit a tenant's excuse for failure to perform because of a pandemic or a government shutdown. Now, while you can't necessarily waive the protections of the eviction moratorium, there might be other creative ways to try to get the tenant to perform or guarantee certain performance under the lease. I'd also suggest looking at your rules and regulations, as I mentioned before. Have things changed, or would you consider revising anything because of the impact of COVID-19, government shutdowns, civil unrest? There has been a lot that's happened in the past year that may want you to look at your rules and regulations and consider, maybe something should be tweaked, or maybe something should be strengthened, or we don't want to have this obligation. So consider that. And then maximizing technology to screen tenants more efficiently and comprehensively, as I had kind of mentioned previously, background checks and credit checks. And I'll let Ashley kind of go forward a little bit and explain one really cool feature that PocketList has that can be helpful for landlords.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. This is all really great information. And I did get a couple questions through the Q&A about if this recording is going to be available after the event. And I wanted to make sure that you know that it is, because this is a lot of really, really useful information. So you will have an opportunity to go back and listen to the recording again. And we do have a handful of other questions that I want to get to asking you, Nicole. But before I do, I just want to touch on one PocketList feature that we offer landlords that will help with some of this stuff. We've got a ton of different services and data analytic tools and things to help, from the mom and pop owner to a giant property management company. And one of the exciting features we're going to be rolling out here pretty soon is called Renter Score. And as you all probably know, if you've been involved in the renting leasing process, you don't often get to see the creditworthiness or the qualifications of a renter until they've actually applied for the place. What we're going to be doing at PocketList is actually pre-screening renters up front. And having all their credentials kind of rolled up into one really neat and tidy and trustworthy rating that you can actually click into and see the details of. but it'll be available to you to be able to see in real time as you're actually chatting with a potential prospective tenant within the PocketList platform. So we're really excited about this. We really think it's going to be a game changer in terms of not only saving you time and money in reducing your vacancy time, but also in some of these things that Nicole's talked about in helping, fully vet your prospective tenants and renters to make sure that you're getting really great renters who are going to take care of your property and pay you the rent. So anyway, I will have my information up on the last slide. I'm also going to be sending out the recording, so you'll all have my information. If you want any more information on this, or if there's a question from the presentation that you didn't get to ask, please don't hesitate to reach out to me anytime. And let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, so let's get down to the questions. So Nicole, most of these are for you. There is one question is, what takes priority, county or California state moratorium?
Okay, so the state moratorium will generally give you the general guidelines of what to do, and the county will probably add additional requirements. So they should be working together. For example, in the county of LA, you have the tenant has additional time to repay the rent, but they still have to the landlord still has to follow the notice provisions provided by the state. So I kind of like to just look at city, county, state. That's just how I process it better, but they should generally work together and not conflict.
Makes sense. Hopefully that was clear, but if the person that asked that question has a follow-up, feel free to put it in the Q&A and I'll make sure we ask it. So we had a couple questions on commercial property. So one was, is all of this information that you presented, is this pertinent just to residential leases, or would the same considerations apply to a commercial office space?
So this is very specific to residential. There are eviction moratorium in place in various cities and counties relating to commercial, but it's a very different consideration, and it's very different. So the answer is no, this was pretty much residential, but offline, I'm happy to answer questions. Feel free to reach out to me, and we deal a lot with commercial related evictions, especially during COVID-19. So I'm happy to answer that at a later time.
Okay, perfect. And then the other commercial question we got is, are commercial evictions not based on COVID rent payments going through right now, or is it a total waste of time to serve an unlawful detainer?
It's not necessarily a total waste of time. A tenant can, for a certain, I don't know exactly where the property is, but in certain cities in the county of LA, there was a period of time where the tenant could claim some protection and get additional time to repay the rent. So it might not be a total waste of time. I do encourage you to try to speak to the tenant and see if there's a payment plan or some sort of settlement to work out, because the court systems are really backed up right now. And so even if you do file an unlawful detainer or a breach of lease action, your case isn't going to get heard right away.
Okay, great. Another question is, are owners liable if tenants have COVID exposure on the premises?
Good question. Generally, no. It's kind of hard to pinpoint liability for COVID-19, especially given how easily it's transmissible. And I think that it's a good idea for landlords to post notices of how tenants can protect themselves, wearing masks, encouraging tenants not to go out. If there is a known COVID-19 case within your building, you can't there's health privacy laws. You can't necessarily disclose who has it or perhaps what unit, it's in, but perhaps notifying people that somebody who was in the building, was diagnosed with COVID-19, and we encourage people to wear masks and stay safe. So I think there's kind of some general things a landlord should do, and it's good practice to do, but I think it would be hard to pinpoint liability on the landlord for that type of exposure.
That makes sense. Okay, so here's a situational question. What if a tenant is on a month-to-month lease? This owner is interested in selling a single family home that they use as a rental right now. And if the property is in California, but they live out of state, can they ask them to leave? They have not missed any rental payments, but they believe there is some potential COVID issues with them.
Okay, this sounds really specific, so I'll try to answer it as the best I can. You may be able to evict them. It kind of depends how long they've been renting, even though they're on a month-to-month now. I think that the person who asked that question should really look to the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 first, because that provided more guidance about residential tenants and evictions. If the tenant is in the rental unit for more than a year, they do have additional protections and additional notices that need to be served on them before you terminate the tenancy or evict them. However, and I think we'd have to look to see where that house is and if there are any other rent restrictions or rent stabilization ordinances that are in place. But in Los Angeles, with respect to the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, a lot of single family homes are exempt. So it sounds like you may be able to get them out either by just terminating the tenancy if it's month to month, or following the procedures of the Tenant Protection Act to evict them.
Okay, perfect. It sounds like a little more due diligence.
Yeah, so there's a lot of detail there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So another question is there a quote best way to communicate with tenants about a COVID-related payment issue? Example is email better than text? Is a mailed letter better than calling, etc.?
I would say let's get it in writing. I would say if you can, I would certainly suggest in writing. If a letter by mail or by posting in mail is probably the best way. I know that a lot of people text message now. I really don't suggest using text message unless it's for, a quick check-in kind of thing. But you might be using these notices as evidence in court later on. And so that's why I think just written letters or posting is the best way. Email is good. It traces it. I think, you can kind of track when it was sent and if it was read. So that's generally good. But I would also suggest just looking at your lease and seeing what the lease says about permissible notices. Most leases say by mail or personal service.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is a couple questions in one. If you want to rent a room in your house, does it require a permit? Do you need to register with the housing authority? Does the moratorium apply in the same way or differently?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. I would suggest checking the LA housing website to see. And I think it kind of depends on what kind of lease you're doing. If it's kind of like a roommate situation, I don't know if you necessarily need to register with the LA housing. But I would double check. I'm not entirely clear about that. With respect to, I think part of the question was does the moratorium apply to that person? Yes, if they're a renter, it does apply to that person. We actually had an interesting situation a couple months ago where the homeowner was renting out one of the rooms to somebody else and then said that they don't feel safe living with somebody who wasn't necessarily following the COVID-19 protocols that the owner was following. And the owner felt like they weren't safe because they were being exposed, by this other person being in there. So it's an interesting argument to make. The owner kind of worked it out with the tenant on their own instead of having to file anything. So I can't say that it's a successful argument that maybe evicting the tenant based on a health and safety issue, that you don't feel safe with the tenant there, but it's an argument, and it's a valid argument. So there might be ways to evict the tenant.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, a couple more here. One is the regulations for COVID in leasing seems pretty haphazard. If there were another pandemic, what would you change about eviction moratoria, et cetera, to help the market weather shocks like this in the future?
That is a good question, and I agree. It's very tricky, and I think that the moratorium are kind of putting certain band-aids on the situation, and I don't know if they're really going to stick, and I don't know if they're really helping. So I do like the part of the moratorium for the transition period where it's requiring tenants to pay 25%, because at least that's helping landlords get some money and requiring tenants to do something and perform something under the lease instead of just having, a tenant who's freeloading off the landlord. But I haven't, a lot of this has just been, attacking the situation instead of really delving deep into what they should have done. Both sides, landlords and tenants, are hurting. I will note that I did not mention this, but the SB 91 also provides some protections for landlords with respect to their lenders, and I do encourage you to speak to your mortgage broker to see if there is anything that you could do from the lender's perspective to help you out if you are not receiving rent and can't make your mortgage payments. So I don't really have a direct answer for you, but I do think requiring the tenant to pay something would help a little bit. I forget if I mentioned this or not, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that just because the tenant doesn't have to pay the rent right now or right away does not mean that they're completely forgiven of the rental debt. None of the moratorium in place forgive rental debt. It's just delaying when the tenant can repay it.
That's an important distinction for sure. Okay, once a tenant has claimed a COVID hardship, can the landlord ask for documentation that the income status has not changed or improved with the extended protection period? For example, if they were called back to work or got a new job.
Perhaps. I would probably say yes, as long as you're not harassing the tenant about it. The tenant could be claiming some sort of COVID financial distress, and maybe they are back to work, but maybe they're also helping out a family member who is sick. So just because you see certain information doesn't necessarily mean that they're not experiencing some sort of financial hardship. But I think trying to find out what the hardship actually is, and I think it's worth looking into. And then if you are at a point where you are filing an action for rental debt or eviction, you may be able to actually get more of this information through the court procedures, through discovery and stuff like that.
Okay, great. And then just a couple more. Is it legal to sell the building with tenants who are currently not paying?
Is it legal to sell the building with tenants who are not paying? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, you can sell the building. That's something that the buyer would have to be aware of. Um, I'm working on a transaction now where there's a handful of units that have large rental debts, and the buyer is just taking that as a risk and got a reduction in purchase price because of that. And then the buyer is going to try to perhaps get some money out of those tenants. That's just, it's permissible. It's just, a risk that a buyer would have to take.
Yep. Okay, great. And then last one, and then we'll wrap up. This is a good question. Are either of you personally landlords? And if so, have you had to deal with any issues related to COVID? And what are you personally doing to prepare for the post-COVID real estate market? Nicole, I don't know about you, if you have an answer to that or not.
I'm not personally a landlord. I work with plenty of them though. um, and have I had to deal with any issues related to COVID with respect to real estate? I mean, I'm a real estate attorney, so beginning of March, when this was all becoming really real, and we were quickly working on clients' leases to make sure they were protected or how to better protect them, and kind of evaluating what types of exposures there were. So that kind of goes into preparing for the post-COVID real estate market. I think just making sure you're in a good position as best you can financially. You know, the types of tenants you have, good relationship with your lender, and also really just evaluating your leases to make sure that they are protecting you the best they can during this time. Like I mentioned before, you can't necessarily waive the eviction moratorium, but there might be other creative ways to make sure that you have a really good, tightened up lease.
Yeah. And just for me, I am personally a very, very small time landlord. Luckily, I've not had any COVID issues with any of my tenants, but I have been a lot more communicative with all of them during this time, just to keep an open, channel of communication, making sure they're happy, they're feeling taken care of. So I think things like that go a long way right now. And to Nicole's point, if an issue did come up, having that open line of communication to be able to approach them with some sort of conversation about a creative solution outside of threatening eviction or something like that is really, really important. And the other thing, just to touch kind of a little bit more on PocketList and how we're able to help. We have a lot of kind of unique services and features to our landlord platform that really help, engage and make sure you're maintaining your reputation well as a landlord, that you're managing your property well, and that you're kind of getting some insights into where your tenants are in terms of if they're planning to move out or whatever. We have a lot of information. Our system leverages the information that tenants provide us about the units that they're in. And so there's a lot of insights that we're able to provide through our platform too. So I will invite, kind of in closing, we are so appreciative to everyone for joining. Thank you so, so much, Nicole. We just want to make sure that everyone on this call knows that here at PocketList, we're here for you. We really want to help. We know this is a difficult time, and we feel strongly that we have some really compelling features that can be helpful. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can do, or if you want to learn more about our features. We would love to have you as part of our community here at PocketList. So here's my information. I'm also, like I said, going to be sending a follow-up email. I know that we didn't get to a handful of questions. So we will be responding to those after the event. I apologize we weren't able to get to them. But thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you, Rains Feldman,
You're
for the
welcome.
time and for lending your expertise. We are so appreciative. And thank you all. We hope to hear from you very soon.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.